The first thing Maraosi noticed about the alien sky was that it had no patience. Back home, a desert night came on slow, dusk bleeding into purple, stars waking one by one like neurons firing in some vast brain coming to life. You could watch it happen if you had the stillness in you. 2 years alone in the Sonoran had taught her that, to sit on a cooling rock and let the dark arrive around you, unhurried, the Milky Way appearing not all at once but in increments, a secret the universe was willing to tell if you stopped demanding it. The sky above Varath Prime did not negotiate. It went from scorched amber to absolute black in the space of 3 breaths, and then the stars came on like a switch thrown. All of them at once, 10,000 more than she had ever seen, in colors human retinas struggled to categorize. There was no easing in, no permission asked. The dark simply arrived and the light came with it, simultaneous, the way a decision comes when it has already been made. She pressed her back against the stone and did not move. 14 months on this planet. 14 months since the Covenant ships had come through the outer belt, and the last of the colony ships had burned like paper lanterns against the dark, and still she had not stopped cataloging the differences. The sky, the silence, the way the wind smelled of something almost iron, almost sweet, that her brain kept trying to file as blood and kept failing. The way the horizon here was too wide, the planet's curvature less than Earth's, the line of it pulling at something deep in her geometry, some instinctive calculation of scale that said, "You are smaller here than you have ever been." She was, she supposed, an astronomer in the same way a castaway was a navigator. Technically correct, functionally useless. The equipment was long gone. The data was gone. What remained was the habit of looking up and the stubborn conviction, half-trained, half-religious, that looking was itself a form of knowing. The Varath did not understand this. She had spent 11 of those 14 months as a specimen, which was more comfortable than it sounded, and less than it might have been. The Varath were curious the way deep water was cold, completely, indifferently, without malice. They had studied her diet, her sleep cycles, her response to pain stimuli, her capacity for abstract language, her emotional triggers, her dreams. They had provided food that would not kill her. They had not provided freedom, but they had also not been cruel, which put them ahead of a not insignificant portion of her own species. Their lead researcher, she had named him Faultline, for the way his exoskeletal plates shifted at his thorax when he was processing something unexpected, had spent 6 weeks trying to understand why she looked at the sky. Not what she was looking for, why she looked. The distinction she had eventually grasped was profound. The Varath looked at the sky the way humans looked at a weather report, for data, for threat assessment, for navigational input. The sky was a source. You extracted what you needed and you moved on. You did not sit with it. You did not let it do something to you. The idea that the sky could do something to a person, could change the quality of their interior state through the mere act of being witnessed, had required 3 weeks of comparative xenopsychology sessions before Faultline's plates had shifted in the particular way she'd come to associate with genuine cognitive disruption. "You are changed," he had said in the clicking, tonal language she'd spent 5 months learning, by looking, yes. To what purpose? She'd thought about how to answer that for a long time. About the nights in the Sonoran, with her back on a cooling rock, and the Milky Way overhead like a road someone had loved enough to light. About the bristlecone pines she'd photographed once in the White Mountains of California, trees 4,000 years old, shaped by wind into postures of such improbable survival that the word endurance had seemed insufficient, the word ancient had seemed insufficient, the whole vocabulary of longevity had seemed insufficient, and something else had been required. Some word that didn't exist yet for a thing that keeps breathing long past any reasonable expectation that it should. "It reminds me what I am," she had finally said. Faultline's plates had shifted very far. "You require reminding?" She'd almost laughed. Constantly. That conversation had been 3 months ago, and something in the Varath's study of her had shifted after it, become less clinical, more something she couldn't name. She was still a specimen, but Faultline had begun in his way to listen differently. Tonight she was outside because Faultline had allowed it, a privilege extended 6 weeks prior, with the same careful bureaucratic process the Varath applied to all decisions of biological ethics. She was in the enclosed garden enclosure, which was open to the sky but surrounded on all sides by walls of the same dark, basalt-smooth material as the rest of the facility. The enclosure was 60 meters across, maybe 70, big enough to feel like space, small enough to remember it wasn't. She sat on the ground, which was covered in something like gravel but softer, aggregate from the local riverbed Faultline had explained, chosen for its thermal neutrality. She had her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, the same posture she'd held on hundreds of desert nights, and she watched the alien sky perform its characteristic impatience. In the dark, 3 moons rose in sequence, each a different size, each a different rust cream color. Their light did not mix the way she'd expected. It layered, each wavelength finding its own surface, so that the garden was simultaneously 3 colors of night, each shadow falling in a slightly different direction. She turned her hands palm up in her lap and watched the triple shadows of her fingers. A sound. The door behind her. Faultline did not announce himself. The Varath had no social convention around silence, treated it as a neutral medium rather than a loaded one. He crossed the gravel to where she sat and folded his lower limbs beneath him in the posture she'd come to recognize as attentive rest. "You are looking again," he said. "I am." A pause. She had learned that his pauses meant processing, not discomfort. "The 3 moons of Varath Prime," he said eventually. "You have seen them on 217 previous occasions since your arrival. 218 now. You continue to find them changed." She thought about that. The moons weren't changed, of course. She was, yes, she said. The plates at his thorax moved. She had cataloged 19 distinct configurations. This one was the one she privately called wanting to understand a thing that resists understanding. 14 months. 11 of them as a specimen, 3 of them as something else. She wasn't sure what the Varath word for it would be. Interlocutor, maybe. Subject who speaks back. Whatever the category, it had conferred small privileges. Outside time. The possibility of this conversation. She had learned, with patience, that the Varath were not a violent species in the way humans often reflexively assumed of invaders. They were expansionist, systematic. They moved through space the way water moved through rock, not because they chose to destroy, but because their logic ran along channels that had no notation for the things they displaced. The colony ships at the outer belt had been an obstacle, so they had removed the obstacle. There was no cruelty in it, and there was also no kindness, which was a thing she'd had to sit with a long time before it stopped feeling like the same thing. She had learned that the Varath had been cataloging planets like this one, like Earth, for 60 of their years, which was roughly 300 of hers. She had learned that the Covenant was a kind of scientific enterprise, though the word enterprise implied a choice she wasn't sure was present. They studied, they collected, they moved on. The specimens they took stayed taken. She had also learned, this much later, this at cost, that the decision about what to do with a specimen colony was made not by Faultline or his cohort but by the Convocation, a body of senior Varath who met on a cycle she'd come to understand as roughly 14 of her months. The next convocation was in 8 days. "Vaultline," she said. "Yes, the convocation will decide about the colony." A pause. "They will make a determination. And the determination will be one of 3 things." She had worked this out over weeks, carefully, the way she had once worked out orbital mechanics. Patient, precise, willing to be wrong and correct. Continued study, relocation to a different facility. Or, she used the Varath word that meant, as nearly as she could translate it, closed archive, the third option. The plates shifted. Not wanting to understand, something she hadn't cataloged before. "You have reasoned this." "Yes, you are concerned." "I am profoundly concerned." A longer pause. The 3 moons continued their layered, improbable business. A wind moved through the garden, carrying that almost iron smell, and she breathed it in and did not flinch anymore, which was a kind of adaptation she hadn't planned. "I wish to understand," Faultline said finally, "why you still look at the sky." She turned to look at him, fully, which the Varath found unusual, a behavioral notation they'd recorded without assigning meaning to. "You've asked me that before. I ask again because the context has changed. You are aware of the convocation. You are aware of the possible determinations. In a human who understood this, I would expect. Our models predict withdrawal, internal processing, reduced external attention. You continue to look outward." The plates moved again, that new configuration. "I find I do not understand why." Mara was quiet for a while. The wind moved again, and somewhere at the far edge of the enclosure, something small rustled in the aggregate. Some permitted local fauna. She'd never seen it directly, only heard it on nights like this. Another thing she'd learned, this planet was alive in small ways, in patient ways, in ways that didn't declare themselves. She thought about the bristlecone pines. She thought about a canyon in Utah she'd photographed one July. The walls lit gold by late afternoon sun. The river at the bottom reduced by drought to a green whisper, still going, still insisting on itself. She thought about how she'd sat at the rim for 3 hours and watched the shadow line move across the rock, the slowness of it, the weight of that much time made visible in stone. She thought about the last message she'd received from the colony before the Covenant ships came through, which had been her colleague Petros saying the Auroras were the best he'd ever seen, and had she seen, and she'd been in transit and she hadn't, and that was the last she'd heard of him. Because it was always the point, she said, looking, bearing witness. That's what we do, even when we're scared, especially when we're scared. She paused. You study us. You've studied me for 14 months. What have you learned? The plates. New configuration again. Something that overlapped with wanting to understand, but wasn't it. That you are more durable than your physiology predicts, Faultline said. That your stress responses are pronounced, but your recovery from stress is also pronounced. That you form emotional attachments to objects, to locations, to data, to what you have observed. That these attachments appear to function as structural support rather than liability under certain conditions. Under certain conditions, she repeated. What conditions? A long pause. We have not determined the threshold. She turned back to the sky. I think the threshold is this. It doesn't work if you're only holding the attachment for yourself. It only works if you intend to, if the observation is for someone, even if that someone doesn't exist yet. She spread her hands, palms up again, the triple shadows of her fingers 3 different lengths. I didn't photograph those canyons for me. I did it because I wanted someone else to be able to see what I saw. Even if they never would, even if no one ever looked at the pictures. She looked at her hands. That's what the looking is. It's witness for someone else. It's the sky doesn't care if I see it, but someone should. Someone should notice. The garden was very quiet. Even the small thing in the aggregate had gone still. Faultline's plates shifted through 4 configurations in rapid succession, which she had never seen before. Dr. Osei, he said, I would like to show you something. He had never called her that. 14 months. He had always used the specimen designation, then a pronoun her translator rendered as subject. Never the name. She stood. He led her through the facility along corridors that were empty at this hour. The Varath operated on a cycle she'd roughly mapped to a 31-hour day, and this was a rest period for most of the cohort. Their feet, her boots, his 4-limbed articulation made different sounds on the basalt-smooth floor, a rhythm she'd never thought about before. He led her past the study rooms, past the genomics lab, past the chamber where the convocation materials were stored in sealed archives she'd never been permitted near. He stopped at a door she'd never seen opened. He opened it. Inside was a room the size of a concert hall, and it was filled with images. Not images on screens. She'd seen their screens. The flat data-efficient displays of a species that treated imagery as information. These were. She didn't have a word for what they were. Projections, maybe. Rendered in light from sources she couldn't locate, filling the space the way the sky filled space, surrounding rather than facing. Landscapes. She recognized some of them. Jupiter's cloud bands as seen from one of its inner moons. A gas giant she didn't recognize, its rings edge on. A city of ice dust. A pulsar, rendered in false color, its jets drawn like an argument. Oceans of worlds she'd never catalogued, lit by suns of the wrong color. And among them, Earth. There was her planet. Rendered from orbit, the Pacific filling most of the frame. A cyclone the size of a continent organizing itself in slow spiral over the tropics. The Himalayas casting shadow eastward. The green and brown of inhabited continents. The blue that she had once tried to explain to a friend who'd never seen it from space. That it was the most improbable color she'd ever seen. That from up there it looked chosen. It looked like something that had been made specifically to make you feel the loss of it before you'd even left. She stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, and all of it turned with her. What is this room? She managed. Documentation, Faultline said. Of what we have found. Of what has existed. A pause. Of what we have, in the course of our work, closed. She understood what he was telling her. This is the archive. Yes. These are the worlds you've. Yes. She stood in it. She let it be as big as it was. She was very good by now at letting things be as big as they were. You built this, she said. The practice began 11 cycles before I was designated. I am told a single researcher initiated it. I am told the stated purpose was scientific documentation. I am told this was accepted. The plates moved. The new configuration, the one she couldn't name. I have been told by several colleagues that the stated purpose was the only purpose. I am not certain I agree. She looked at Earth, the cyclone, the improbable blue. You look at it, she said. The archive. I find I return to it frequently. I am uncertain of the purpose. She almost smiled. She felt the almost smile and held it very carefully because it was fragile and it mattered, and she didn't want to let it become less than it was. I think I can explain the purpose, she said. If you want. Faultline was quiet. His plates did not move. For a moment he was very still, and in her 14 months she had never seen him still. I believe, he said, that I have wanted this explained for a very long time. She took a breath. She was an astronomer. She had spent 2 years in the Sonoran Desert with a camera and a truck and more night sky than most humans ever earned. And she had understood the whole time that she was not the point. The sky was not the point. The point was the space that opened in you when you looked at something vast enough and long enough and with enough willingness to be changed by it. The point was that this space made you useful to other people, to the record, to the long and ongoing argument that the universe made with anyone willing to participate. She realized, been making that argument in this room for the last 14 months. One conversation at a time, one answered question at a time. One skywatching session at a time, while the Varath researcher who'd been assigned to study her had come back, night after night, in what she'd thought was professional diligence and was now not sure was only that. She talked for a long time. She talked about witness, what it meant to see a thing and refuse to let it pass unacknowledged. She talked about the bristlecone pines and what it meant to be 4,000 years old in a world that kept changing under you, to be shaped by the wind into something improbable and keep breathing anyway. She talked about canyons and the language that stone wrote with time, the slowness of it, the patience required to read it. She talked about what it meant to lose a world, not the logistical loss, which was devastating, but the qualitative loss, the specific and irreplaceable texture of a thing that had existed nowhere else in the universe and would now exist nowhere. She talked about Petros and the auroras. She talked about what it meant to be a witness for someone who wasn't there yet, the obligation of seeing. The way that obligation, once understood, changed what you were, made you larger than your survival, made you able to hold more than your fear. Faultline was very still throughout all of it. When she was done, the room was very quiet, and the images of lost worlds turned around them, and the Earth's cyclone organized itself in its slow, indifferent spiral. The convocation, Faultline said, convenes in 8 days. I know. I am not a member of the convocation. I know. The determination regarding the colony, regarding your people, is not within my authority. I know. She kept looking at Earth. I'm not asking you to change it. Then what are you asking? She turned to face him. I'm asking you to be a witness. She paused. I'm asking you to see us, not as specimens, not as data, to actually see what we are and what it would mean for us not to be here anymore. She paused again, and then to do whatever you do with that. I'm not telling you what to do with it. I'm just asking you to look. The plates moved through configurations she had never seen. More than 4, 6, 7, rapid, consecutive, something that in a human she would have called a reckoning. Then he was still again. I will attend the convocation, he said. I am not a member. I will request permission to present findings. This is within standard protocol. The findings I will present will be my study of this specimen as is appropriate. He paused. I anticipate that my framing of the findings will be comprehensive. She held the almost smile again. Let it be what it was. Comprehensive. The data set is substantial, 14 months of continuous observation. I have documented extensively the subject's capacity for contextual reasoning, for adaptation, for complex interspecies communication, for what I would categorize as perspective integration. Another pause. I have also documented several instances in which the subject's behavior altered my own processing in ways I had not predicted and cannot fully explain without reference to frameworks our science does not currently possess. She looked at him. Vaultline, she said, and used his real name. The tonal sequence she'd worked out over months, the one that caused his plates to shift in a way no other sound did. What do you think is going to happen? He was quiet for a long time. I think, he said carefully, that the convocation will be presented with data they have not previously considered. I think that data will be disruptive. I think the outcome is uncertain. He paused. In my experience, uncertain outcomes are more frequently revised toward continuation than toward closure. The convocation prefers to understand a thing before it closes it. They have not previously had reason to believe there was more to understand. 8 days. She thought about the desert. She thought about lying on her back on a cooling rock with the whole dark sky over her and feeling not small. That was never the right word. People always said small, but it wasn't small. Feeling located, placed, knowing exactly where she was in the structure of things, and finding that the structure was big enough to hold her without diminishing her. She thought about what it would mean to go back. The colony, such as it survived, the others in whatever facilities they'd been distributed across, the long work of whatever came next. She thought about Petros and the Auroras. "Can I come?" she asked. "To the convocation?" A pause. That would be irregular. "I know. It has not been done, I know." The plates moved. That configuration she couldn't name. The new one, the one that had appeared tonight, the one she was starting to think might be something like respect. "I will inquire," he said. The next 8 days were the slowest of her 14 months, which was saying something. She was not idle. She understood the value of not being idle, understood it in her bones, in the trained muscles of 2 years sleeping on cots under the open desert sky, in the particular stubbornness her mother had called pig-headed, and her thesis advisor had called methodological tenacity, and that she herself had never found a satisfying word for, because it wasn't a disposition, it was more like a baseline, a refusal to accept stillness as the only response to difficulty. She wrote. She had been writing since early in her captivity, first in her head, then when Faultline had provided a data interface for her continued research access on the screen. She wrote about what she'd observed, the Varath, their science, their language, which she'd documented in more detail than any other human would have the chance to, and which she found beautiful in the way that all complex systems were beautiful. The elegance of a thing that had evolved to do exactly what it needed to do, and nothing else. She also wrote about the sky. She wrote about what she'd seen from the garden enclosure on 218 nights. The movement of the 3 moons, the particular quality of the light, the wind and its almost iron smell, the small hidden thing in the aggregate that she'd never managed to see, but had learned the hours of, the small reliable percussion of its presence. She wrote it for someone who wasn't there yet. She slept badly, which was not new. On the 3rd day, Faultline came to her study room and told her that her attendance at the convocation had been approved as an educational exhibit, which was technically a specimen category, but one that she had, somehow, never been placed in before. She said thank you. She meant it. On the 6th day, she asked Faultline what the convocation chamber looked like. He described it. A circular space, open to the sky at its center, surrounded by the tiered seating of the 39 convocation members. The sky was always open, he told her, whatever the weather. It was a structural feature, not a practical one. Why? She asked. The plates moved. It was determined by the founders that decisions of consequence should be made with an awareness of scale, he said. The open sky provides this awareness. She sat with that for a while. Vaultline, she said. Yes. Who decided that? A pause. A researcher, he said. In the 2nd cycle of the Covenant, it is in the record. Her designation. He provided the tonal sequence, which her translator rendered as a name she privately transcribed as Lumen. She argued for it before the original convocation. She argued that a species which made decisions in enclosed spaces would inevitably make smaller decisions than a species that did not. The founders accepted her recommendation. Mara thought about Lumen, who had been dead for 300 of her years, and whose idea was still open to the sky. She was right, Mara said. On the 8th day, she dressed in what she had, which was not much. She had developed a habit, in the desert, of packing light, not because she was an ascetic, but because she'd found that the weight of unnecessary things made the sky feel farther away. What she had here was a version of the same principle. A few items, a few small things that were hers, that she'd assembled from what the facility provided. A small piece of reddish stone from the garden enclosure that she'd asked permission to keep, the data interface. Her hands, which still looked like her hands. The convocation chamber was a 40-minute walk from the facility. Faultline walked with her. The sky was the amber of midday on Vareth Prime, the sun larger than Earth's and more yellow-white, and the landscape around the path was the strange layered geology she'd come to love. Strata of dark red and cream and charcoal, deposited over millions of years, by processes she'd spent months trying to understand from available data. The path was long and she walked it slowly and she looked at everything. The chamber was as described, circular, open, tiered. The 39 convocation members were already seated when she entered with Faultline, and their collective attention, 39 sets of compound visual organs, each with a slightly different spectral range, each adapted to slightly different light conditions, each trained on her with the focused curiosity of beings for whom observation was the primary verb, was the most concentrated form of being seen she had ever experienced. She stood in the center and looked up through the open roof at the amber sky. She thought, I am not small, I am located. The proceedings were in full formal Varath, faster than she could entirely follow, and Faultline provided low-voiced translation throughout. Not of everything, of the substance, the shape of the argument. The convocation reviewed the colony status, the resource assessments, the progress of study at various facilities. Numbers, categorizations, the long bureaucratic language of a civilization that had learned to process decisions about inhabited worlds the way an accountant processed ledgers. And then Faultline rose. He was not a convocation member. He had been permitted to present as a researcher with relevant findings, which was a protocol available but rarely invoked. He rose and he spoke for, she tracked the time, 47 minutes. She caught about 60% of it directly, and from what she caught and what Faultline had translated to her in his preparation, she understood the shape of it. He had documented a human being for 14 months. He had documented adaptation, communication, problem-solving, emotional complexity, meaning-making. He had documented a specific behavior, the looking at the sky, that his models had initially classified as surveillance, and then as entertainment, and then as something his models lacked the category for. He had documented that this behavior had changed him. He presented this as a data point. He was careful about it. Varath careful, which meant he presented it in the most defensible, most scientifically conservative framing available. He had been altered by the study process in ways that constituted measurable changes to his processing architecture. He had documentation. He could produce the before and after scans if the convocation required them. He was not claiming a subjective experience. He was claiming an objective, measurable change. He was claiming that something had passed between the specimen and the researcher in the direction the researcher had not predicted. He was claiming that this was, in the Varath sense, data. The convocation was quiet in a way she had learned. From 14 months of Varath observation was not nothing. Then one of the members, senior, her designation's tonal sequence older and more layered, someone Faultline had told her was called something she transcribed as the keeper of patterns, asked a question. Faultline translated it low and fast. What was the nature of the transfer? What specifically had passed from the specimen to the researcher? Faultline answered in the language of the archive room. Witness. He had, he said, begun to perform an act that had no adequate Varath name, but which he could describe functionally as the deliberate retention of observed things beyond their utility, the carrying of seen things as if they had value beyond their informational content. He had begun to return to the archive room not for data retrieval, but for, he paused a long time, for something he was still attempting to classify. Another member spoke, then two more in rapid sequence. The amber light through the open roof shifted slightly, a cloud, maybe, or the movement of the sun, and the shadows in the chamber rearranged themselves, the way shadows always did in layered light on this world. Stood in the center and watched the sky, and waited. She had decided sometime in the last 8 days, done waiting to find out if she would be allowed to survive. That was not a decision, it was a fact. A thing she'd discovered was already true when she'd looked at it carefully. She would either survive this or she wouldn't. That outcome was not, in any fundamental sense, in her hands. What was in her hands was the quality of her attention in the time remaining, the degree to which she was actually present, actually looking, actually here. She was here. The keeper of patterns spoke again, and this time Faultline didn't translate immediately. And she waited, and then he said, She wants to know why you are looking at the sky. She lowered her gaze from the open roof and found the keeper of patterns across the chamber. Her visual organs were larger than Faultline's, older, in a color she had no word for. Tell her, Mara said, that this is what we do. Tell her that we came from a planet that took 4 billion years to make us, and that we spent every generation since we could think looking up at what made us and asking what it meant. Tell her that we can't stop. It's not a choice. It's the thing we are. Faultline translated. The chamber was quiet. The keeper of patterns spoke. She says, Faultline said, and his plates were in the new configuration, the one she thought might be respect. That this is, he paused, and she knew he was finding the right translation, the most accurate rendering, This is a thing that should continue. The deliberation took another 2 hours. Mara sat on the floor of the convocation chamber. She asked permission first, and it was given, with what she was starting to recognize as Varath bemusement, and looked at the rectangle of sky through the open roof and watched it do what skies did. Change, slowly, the amber deepening, the light shifting, the first ghost of one moon appearing before the sun was fully gone. She held the piece of stone from the garden enclosure. She thought about Petros and the auroras, and she let herself grieve that, fully for the first time, not the controlled, self-monitored processing she'd been doing for 14 months, afraid that if she opened it fully, it would end her. But the real thing, the weight of it, the specific absence of him, and all of them, every name she'd carried since the colony ships burned. She let it be as big as it was. She stayed with it. The sky watched and didn't care, which was fine, which was the whole point, because she cared enough for both of them. When she was ready, she looked up again. The moon had moved, the light had changed. She was still here. When Faultline came to her, he folded his lower limbs and sat beside her on the floor of the convocation chamber, which was also irregular, which was also something he did anyway. The determination, he said. Tell me. The colony, the remaining human population across all Covenant facilities, is to be classified under a new category. This category does not previously exist in the Covenant's organizational framework. The Keeper of Patterns is calling it a tonal sequence she couldn't transcribe, which translates approximately as active archive. She thought about that. Active, ongoing, continuous. A record that is still being made. Not closed, not closed, she looked at the sky. The first moon was a sliver of rust cream at the edge of the open roof. The light of it falling across the floor in a stripe she could have stepped across. Vault line, she said. Yes. What happens to an active archive? It is the plates moved, it is studied, it is attended to, it is witnessed. He paused. This is, I am informed, the first time the convocation has applied this category to a biological population. There will need to be new protocols. She thought about the Keeper of Patterns, who had looked at her and asked why she was looking at the sky, and who had decided the answer was sufficient reason to change the architecture of how the Covenant organized its understanding of the things it found in the dark between stars. She thought about Lumen, 300 years dead, whose idea was still open to the sky. She thought about bristlecone pines. We're going to need to talk to the others, she said, the other humans. They'll need to know what's happened. They'll need information, contact, the ability to communicate with each other. I anticipate these protocols will take considerable time to establish. I know. I'm not asking for it to be easy. I'm asking for it to be started. She paused. I have time. She did. She had apparently, and against all reasonable expectation, a great deal of time. The same stubborn, improbable, wind-shaped, 4,000-year quantity of it that she'd learned to recognize in the desert, in the rock, in the sky, in anything that refused to stop being what it was. She stood finally from the floor of the convocation chamber. Her knees ached. She was not, physically, what she'd been 14 months ago, and she was more than she'd been, and both of these things were true simultaneously, the way most true things were. She looked up through the open roof. The sky above Varath Prime was moving into night with its characteristic impatience. Amber to purple in the space of minutes, the stars beginning to appear not slowly, but in sudden multitudes. But she was used to it now. She knew how to watch it even at this speed. She knew how to find the shape of the change in the middle of the change, how to be present to it even when it didn't give you time. 14 months ago, she'd thought this sky had no patience. She understood now that it wasn't patience it lacked. It was permission. It didn't ask permission, and it didn't wait for her to be ready. It simply moved, and the question was only whether she was looking. She was looking. She pressed the piece of red stone in her hand and looked at the stars of an alien sky, appearing all at once in their uncatalogued thousands, and she held what she'd seen and what she still intended to see, and she thought, someone should know. Someone should carry this. Someone not yet born will want to know that we were here and that we looked and that we kept looking even when we didn't know if it would matter. Because it always mattered. Because that is the thing we are. She would write it down. She already was.